Good soggy morning. Welcome and thank you for braving the miserable weather. I'm Ann Hargraves, chair of the Summer Lecture Series Committee. Some of us are here in the auditorium and some of us are home watching the live stream. We welcome members of our sister programs who are joining us remotely from the University of Georgia and UMass Boston. We thank the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth for their assistance in locating speakers and in general encouragement. We thank our underwriters who support the entire 2023 series, the Barron Foundation, Caldwell Law, Concord Coach, Kendall at Hanover, Ledger Bank, and the Village, as well as the sponsor for this session, Mascoma Bank. Just in case there is anyone attending for the first time, I will remind you of the Q&A procedures. Those in the auditorium were given an index card when they entered. Please write your questions on this card and drop them in the basket on the stage, which is right there. For those on live stream, please enter your questions in the chat window. Someone will transcribe the questions and give them to the moderator. If you like, add your first name and location to your question. We'd also like to invite you to a post-lecture discussion session, which will be held immediately after the lecture in OSHER's classroom 3A. Now it is my pleasure to welcome moderator Shahzad Kazi, Chief Operating Officer of the China Beige Book, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning, everyone. I'm Shahzad Kazi. As Anne mentioned, we've got a great lineup here today. So let me start by introducing the speakers, and then perhaps I can also do a quick run of the show, let everybody know what we settled on backstage. So to my right is Professor Jennifer Lind, who is an associate professor in the government department. Professor Lind has written widely about East Asian international relations, U.S. foreign policy towards the region. She has a book that's coming out on China's economic, technological, and military rise to great power. And she, outside of being a professor at the government department, she also has fellowship positions at Harvard, as well as at Chatham House in London. And then to her right is Marc Chandler. Marc has over 30 years of experience in global capital markets, especially the foreign exchange market. He maintains a blog called Marc to Market and is the author of 2 books, Making Sense of the Dollar and The Political Economy of Tomorrow. You may have seen Marc on CNBC and Bloomberg. He appears quite regularly on TV and radio. So great speakers, looking forward to a great discussion today. Now, we're going to do things a little bit differently than I believe we're used to typically. What we're going to have happen here is that Marc and Jennifer will each speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we're going to move to a fireside format between the 3 of us. I have a set of questions that I'd like to ask them for a more interactive format, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll get audience questions and take it from there. So with that, Marc, if you'd like to kick us off, please. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. My job at the banks that I've worked for has often been to, besides provide analysis, I've had to entertain clients. And the other night, I had to entertain some clients, and they wanted to go to a steakhouse. I went to a steakhouse. Wanted to go to a cigar bar. Went to a cigar bar. And they wanted to go to the racetrack. And I know nothing about horses. And I was watching, and then it was like God spoke to me. There, the 7th race was a horse called Lucky 7. In the 7th post position, going off at 7-1 odds. So I bet $777 on Lucky 7. It came in 7th place. The reason I like that story is that that's how our minds work. We look for patterns. And I know many of you probably think the same way I do typically, that you can take all the economists in the world, lay them end to end, and you still don't have enough to reach a conclusion. And what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the conclusions of my own work and sort of reflections about the U.S. and China relationship. I think that to really understand what's going on today, we have to understand that both sides are on their own trajectories. We think about the United States, the end of Bretton Woods, August 15, 1971. We had the Reagan-Thatcher, I think, of the capital offensive, deregulation. Our modern economy is, I think, only understandable through that Reagan-Thatcher prism. But that broke down with the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And since then, we've sort of been lost. And I think that's partly the politics are in flux. We've had we've had some shocks, trying to deal with COVID, the policy outcome, national policy, the import substitution, industrial policy. The traditional political elite in America were challenged as we saw in the 2016 election. China is also on its own trajectory. It was on a trajectory. That changed as President Xi took over. He has a saying, you can't hide an elephant behind a tree. And this is contrasting with its silent, quiet rising that we saw previously under Chinese leaders. Concentration of power, not just in the Communist Party, but in the Xi's wing of the Communist Party. I think that in some ways, China was on a trajectory. Xi has changed that. In the U.S., we were on a trajectory, post-World War II, multilateralism, and that's also been challenged, not just by Trump, but since Trump as well. You know, one of the big topics when we think about the rise of China and where we are now is deglobalization. I really think it predates COVID. I think it predates this rising tensions with China. I have been teaching at NYU for many years and stopped teaching there, and in 2018, 2019, I was teaching at the Bureau of Manhattan Community College. 2019, that's what my students were most interested in, deglobalization, before COVID. Eurasia Group, a think tank, Ian Bremmer, founder, had a book out in 2011 called The G0 World, and tries to capture that idea of, we call it a crisis of hegemonic stability. Typically, we think that capitalism works best when there's one country that can set the rules and enforce the rules. And what Ian Bremmer was pointing to is this no longer existed. This is in 2011. Of course, with the post-COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has given us new language about reshoring, that is bringing back jobs, manufacturing back to the U.S., nearshoring, think about NAFTA, think about Mexico, Colombia, and friendshoring, which is kind of a touchy topic now. Treasury Secretary Yellen had mentioned Vietnam as one of our friendshoring places. And there's been a big pushback against this idea given their one-party state. Also, what's helped give rise to deglobalization is the extensive use of U.S. sanctions, which I'll talk about shortly. The IMF estimates that this move from the global system to a fragmented system is going to be worth about 8.6% to GDP. What we lose from the globalization, what we would have gotten from globalization, then what we lose from this fragmentation. And I think rather, when we think about gains and losses, we have to think of not just joint gains, joint losses, but how those gains and losses are distributed. And I think when we think about the win-win situation, I think that both the U.S. and China will do well in that kind of world of that fragmentation, deglobalization. Manufacturing capacity, we can already see this in a lot of the U.S. economic data. Manufacturing, construction, and building factories skyrocketed. We're probably the best we've been since the end of World War II. The pace of increase, building capacity in the U.S. Whether it really leads to jobs or not is a different story. Traditionally, I think on a global level, there's been two basic models of organization. And the first one is what I think is not as familiar with, but I think we will be again, and that is really spheres of influence. Different power centers had their own sphere of influence, and wars were fought as one power tried to expand its sphere of influence. In the 19th century, Europe and Japan were carving up China into spheres of influence, like the Bund district that still exists in Shanghai. Hong Kong was a sphere of influence for the British. The US, as you know, was preoccupied with our Civil War and emerged on the global stage in the late 19th century, the Spanish-American War. And there the Secretary of State, who was a secretary, personal secretary to Abraham Lincoln, John Hay, wrote a series of notes called the Open Door Notes. And in it he suggested that we could challenge the sphere of influence that some other country was given in China. He said we could seek our own sphere of influence. But he opted and recommended a strategy we call the open door. Late 1800s, early 1900s, the U.S. was defending China's territorial integrity over the imperialist powers in Europe and Japan. This open door replaced this fixed spheres of influence for variable shares of the whole pie. And the variability of your share depended upon your economic prowess. I think we're moving away from the open door, and what we're going to have, I think, emerging is two spheres of influence. A US-led bloc, which is commercially competitive within it, which is, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act has really brought out the ire of Europe for the subsidies that we're going to be giving businesses. So within the US-led bloc, commercially competitive within it, and there's a multi-currency settlement and reserve system. The second largest reserve currency after the dollar is not China, it's the euro. And I think that throughout my career, and I should say even before that, people were always looking for an alternative to the dollar. Think about what happened when Bretton Woods collapsed. And remember what Bretton Woods was, besides the beautiful park. Bretton Woods was where the agreement was reached for the dollar after World War II to be pegged to gold, and all the other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. That system collapsed, and part of the reason it collapsed was not because of Russia or China, but because the U.S. allies, especially in Europe, were demanding more gold than the U.S. wanted to part with. Many countries have never been comfortable with the dollar centralism. Think about what Europe did. After Bretton Woods broke down, they had a snake where all the currencies were pegged to each other, and they would come in and out, and they'd revalue. It wasn't very stable or organized. Then they had the European exchange rate mechanism where the currencies could move 2.5% against each other. And finally, they did away with all of that and adopted a common currency, the euro, in the late 90s. Early in my career, many people thought it was going to be the Japanese yen that was going to replace the dollar. They were the world's largest exporter. They were the world's largest net investment surplus country. After the advent of the euro, people thought it was going to be the euro was going to replace the dollar. Now there was an economy that was roughly the same size and could challenge the U.S. Then shortly after the great financial crisis, many banks, I remember several large banks were recommending that Bitcoin, crypto, was going to replace the dollar. As I think most of us don't really take that too seriously, but now I think that the focus is really more on the RMB, the Chinese currency. And part of what's helped this has been, as I mentioned, these broad sanctions. Just to give you an idea, remember that the sanctions really grow out of the experience the U.S. had in 9/11 and trying to like eliminate terrorist financing. But we found out that it was a very powerful tool. How powerful? In 2021, the U.S. had 9,421 entities sanctioned, a 900% increase in 20 years. Last year, we added about 2,500 names to that entity list and took off 225. So I just presented that just to give you an idea of the extensive use of sanctions and why countries seek an alternative. They don't want to be held captive to annoying the U.S. and being cut out of the dollar market. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and Europe escalated the sanction regime, if you will, froze Russian assets that were on deposit at foreign central banks like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank, froze their reserves, froze their gold, and now many countries, including the US thinking about it, wants to repurpose, if not the reserves, the interest on those reserves to help rebuild Ukraine. The US did the same thing in Afghanistan, taking their reserves, repurposing them. Half of the money of Afghanistan's reserves went to rebuild Afghanistan, and the other half went to compensate 9/11 victims. But this is seen as a real escalation of the sanctions when you're going after foreign central banks, confiscating their wealth, their resources, and repurposing them. There has been a movement now to look for more solidly for a dollar alternative, and those countries like Russia, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and Iraq, they didn't quit the dollar block. They were fired from it. We forced them out, and now they're trying to make a virtue out of necessity. There's also been several technological advancements and changes that make payment systems easier. And by payment systems, how is trade settled? What currency? So when Australia sells iron ore to China, China pays US dollars. When Brazil sells their soybeans to China, they pay US dollars. And so countries want to take out the middleman, the US dollar, and these payment systems allow that to happen. But I want to suggest to you that despite all the talk about the petrodollar, that is not the key source of the dollar's strength or its function in the world economy. Its real function is as a store of value, and that's its reserves, not only for central banks and countries, but for individuals. President Lula from Brazil asked, "Why do we have to use a dollar?" He said, "Who decided that?" But instead of asking to the media and to the world public, he should have been asking his own treasury why they issue dollar-denominated bonds, or Petrobras, the largest oil company, why they sell their product in US dollars. And I want to suggest there's various elements to what makes the dollar that main source of a store of savings. The depth and breadth of our US Treasury market, the broadest, deepest market in the world. And by that, consider what happens when the US government, every Monday, they issue T-bills. An average size of a T-bill auction might be $45 to $50 billion. When a European country issues a bond, they're lucky to get 20 billion euros, roughly $20 billion or so. The size of our market makes it easier for large pools of capital, foreign central banks, sovereign wealth funds, other large pools of capital to park their savings. We also have, of course, the rule of law. The laws may change, but they're transparent while they exist. We, of course, also have the military might. And frankly, there's also some inertia. You know, we all use the same keyboard, QWERTY. And I'm told that there are better, more ergonomically designed keyboards. But who of us is going to use it? This first mover advantage is large, and it can't just be a little bit better, it's got to be a lot better for us to change. And the same is true with the dollar. I want to suggest, too, that many years ago, the French talked about the dollar and the role of the dollar in the world economy and called it an exorbitant privilege. And these days you can find that phrase sort of peppered throughout the media and when they talk about the dollar. But it's not so, I wonder if we look at it closely how true that is. At the time, the idea was because the US dollar was the reserve asset, the US could have lower interest rates than the rest of the world. We could borrow money cheaper. It's in our own currency. But look what happened during the great financial crisis and during COVID. Europe and Japan had negative overnight interest rates. And not just the policy rate is negative, which, by the way, Japan still has a negative interest rate today. Overnight deposit rate, minus 10 basis points. It's hard for me to get my head around negative interest rates. The closest thing I could come to it is I went to an ATM machine that wasn't my bank's, and they charged me $3 to take out $100. That seems like a negative interest rate. But the U.S. interest rates have, throughout the crisis, the U.S. never went into negative territory with our interest rates. Europe, negative overnight interest rates, negative 10-year bond yields. Imagine that, negative yields on 10-year bonds. Next month, August 22nd, which is the week after the anniversary of the end of Bretton Woods agreement, the BRICS countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are going to meet. And there's talk that they will have a gold-backed currency to settle trade among themselves. I think this is very unlikely. I'd put this also with the Bitcoin as a reserve asset. It seems unlikely, partly because China and India want to have the internationalization of their own currencies. Russia and Iran seem to be the loudest promoting this kind of gold-backed currency. China has been very quiet about it, and India has denied it. What China has developed are a series of swap lines. These are agreements between China's central bank and foreign central banks. When a country like Argentina recently ran out of dollars, they tapped a swap line with China. China gave them billions of dollars, billions of RMB, I should say, and Argentina pledged to give them the Argentina peso. Other countries have done this as well, like Pakistan. And I think what this gets to is it doesn't really supplant the dollar as sort of supplement it. Argentina and Pakistan are in terrible financial straits. They don't have access to the dollar because of their own economies, not because they've been cut out of the dollar bloc. And so China offers these swap lines to give these countries, it's almost like producer finance. Argentina takes the RMB and buys Chinese goods or pays their bills to China. Sounds a lot to me like lemon socialism. And then there's the Asian Industrial Investment Bank, AIIB, and the Belt Road Initiative. They sound like they're going to be alternatives to the US-centric world, but I don't think they really are. AIIB, for example, takes subscriptions like the IMF and the World Bank. They take those subscriptions in US dollars. The Belt Road Initiative, as you're familiar with, infrastructure, global infrastructure financed by China. Originally, they were lending RMB, but they found that the RMB was swapped for dollars. So now, the Belt Road Initiative lends dollars, not RMB. I'd like to also suggest that in the world that we live in, even though we think about trade a lot, that is not what really drives either exchange rates or really provides the demand. It comes from the capital markets themselves. The foreign exchange market, which I'm most involved with, average daily turnover, and this is from the Bank for International Settlements, which, as you probably will remember, was created to collect war reparations from Germany after World War I. They now become the central bankers' bank. They do a survey every 3 years. Their last survey last year found that the average daily turnover, the volume in the foreign exchange market, $7.6 trillion a day. $7.6 trillion a day. It's really a mind-boggling number. And the way I can understand it is putting it into a context. Global trade in a year is about $45 trillion. That means not this week, but by the first 2 days of next week, we would have done enough foreign exchange turnover in these 7 days to cover world trade for a year. World GDP is about $100 trillion a year. $100 trillion a year. We'll do that in 3 weeks in the foreign exchange market. The size of the foreign exchange market tells me, relative to trade and goods, is that it's about the capital movement. Not only investing overseas, but also then hedging that currency risk. And that's important. If you have a basket, if you have in your 401ks or your IRAs, you have a basket of international bonds, the currency component can be 2/3 of your return. And in an international equity market, a basket of diversified international equities, a currency could be 1/3 of your total return. So I think that, just to bring it to sort of my part to a conclusion, I think that there's 2 ways that I can see that the dollar's role in the world economy is going to change fundamentally. One is by abdication, and the other is by encroachment. I know many people are worried about encroachment. China's going to do this or do that, and they're going to steal our lunch. They're going to take over the dollar's role. But I, frankly, am more worried about abdication. The extensive use of sanctions is recognized even by Treasury Secretary Yellen as something that encourages other countries to find alternatives. And sometimes I wonder, you know, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations, and the Taft wing of the Republican Party defeated that. Why we didn't join the League of Nations. And I wonder if that Taft wing of the Republican Party now dominates both U.S. political parties. Treasury Secretary Yellen talked about how the multilaterals like the World Bank and the IMF were checks on China. But there's a sense, I think, in Washington among policymakers that the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization no longer do U.S. bidding. Our interests are no longer served in those organizations. So the attempt to either reform those organizations, sidestep them by taking unilateral action, or leaving them. We'll see what happens in the next election. The Anglo-American economies are accused of overdeveloping their capital markets. But many other markets, many other countries have underdeveloped their capital markets. They cannot store their own national savings. So they export their savings to the U.S. Treasury market. In my work, I suggest that the crisis of the 1970s led to the Anglo-American economies were transformed to the safety valves for the world's surplus goods, that is trade deficits in the U.S., Britain, Canada, Australia, and at the same time a safety valve for the world's surplus savings. Not only then a safety valve for the surplus goods in production, but also a safety valve for the world's surplus savings. And I think that the other large economies today don't want that role of absorbing the world's surplus goods or savings. And so that's why I leave you with the idea that the dollar is still going to be central and that Chinese RMB is still going to be a tertiary currency at best. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jennifer, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for all swimming your way to Lebanon today. You're very brave, and I'm sure that you're already seeing that it was worth it. So we're glad you're here. Today in my talk, I'd like to talk a bit about the U.S. export controls against China, and use that as a window into broader structural changes that we've seen in world politics and the global economy. And I'd argue that the export controls are part of a broader shift away from an era of really turbocharged globalization and economic engagement to an era of great power and geoeconomic competition. So first I want to talk about the previous era, which is this intensely globalized, highly engaged era of interdependence. I would argue that this era had certain political foundations to it. So there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so the end of what we would call a bipolar world with two great powers, and the emergence of the US as the dominant superpower, and a period of what many refer to as US liberal hegemony. So that was the political foundations that underpinned the whole nature of that era. And there was a certain worldview that flourished in that era. The dominant idea was economic liberalism. So not in the sense of, Democrats or Republicans, but liberal in the sense of embracing the ideas about individual liberty and the rule of law. So we're talking about the liberals like Immanuel Kant and David Ricardo. As part of this worldview, leaders privileged economic efficiency over vulnerability. And they believed in the inevitability of globalization and the irreversibility of globalization. And there was a similar movement, if you remember, or there's a similar view that the world was moving inevitably toward political liberalism. So remember arguments about the end of history. And there was a belief that in this interdependent world, it wasn't just the big countries and the big military powers that had power, that rather globalization diffused power. And Thomas Friedman told us the world is flat. And that world was thought to incentivize ongoing cooperation. So people thought interdependence raises the costs of using coercion or force against one of your trading partners. So we thought back about China and the time in 1997 when Hong Kong reverted back to China. And people talked about it in terms of, well, China is so economically interdependent with the rest of the world, and particularly with Hong Kong, it would never use coercion or force against Hong Kong because that would be self-defeating. So the phrase that everybody said was, China would never kill the goose that laid the golden eggs. And there was also a belief in the transformative effects of trade. So this really informed US policy toward China. The belief that countries that were brought into the global economy would build up a middle class and would demand more rights. They would demand liberalization. And we cheered this on when we saw it in action in South Korea and Taiwan, which were both authoritarian countries that liberalized during the 1990s. The world that all of these views gave rise to had the following characteristics. So in US-China policy, we saw massive levels of trade, investment, research cooperation, broader integration. So the normalization that Richard Nixon had orchestrated for very realpolitik, very strategic reasons, expanded dramatically under the leadership of Clinton, various Bushes, and other leaders. And in this world, the US and other liberal countries encouraged China's entree and leadership into global governance in trade, finance, international development, standard setting, and so on. And in this world, we saw the global diffusion of supply chains, what my colleague at Dartmouth, Stephen Brooks, calls the globalization of production, as countries saw it in their interest not to produce every step of the supply chain, but they saw it as more efficient and advisable to diffuse certain steps overseas. And we see this notably in this period in the semiconductor realm. Semiconductors, or chips, which we've been hearing a lot about lately, are the brains of every electronic device, from your microwave oven to your iPhone to F-22s. The US invented the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are made out of silicon, and that's why we call it Silicon Valley, this was created there. But in this globalized world, over time, the US firms saw it in their advantage to specialize in one aspect of semiconductor production, which was design. And also the manufacturing of certain specialized equipment for manufacturing semiconductors. But when it comes to actually making the semiconductors themselves, the American firms outsourced this, and first to factories, or what we call fabs, in Japan, and then South Korea, and then also Taiwan. And US dominance in chip manufacturing had been, as I said, complete, total dominance. It fell to 37% in 1999. Today it's 12%. And in Taiwan, particularly with the firm TSMC, which we've also been hearing a lot about lately, we saw US and other leaders accept profound over-reliance on a single supplier. So this was the era of turbo globalization. But now, as I said, we're entering a new era. And the reason for this change, I would argue, is primarily that the political foundation that the geopolitical foundation underpinning all of this has changed dramatically. China has risen to great power. So we're seeing a shift from US dominance to a system with two great powers. But it's not just that big geopolitical shift, although I think that's a very big deal. It's also the shocks we've seen of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war, which are also contributing to big changes in how people think about world politics and the global economy. So let me talk about this new era, the era of geoeconomic competition that we find ourselves in today. The dominant worldview has shifted away from liberalism to being more mercantilist, the view that interdependence creates weakness, both at home in terms of an industrial hollowing out, as well as external vulnerability to coercion and to disruption. The mercantilist view is also evident in shift toward the US embracing industrial policy. The state should play a role in identifying key technologies and supporting this domestic industrial base through, for example, tax breaks and subsidies. In this world, leaders value redundancy and reduced vulnerability, not efficiency. Political scientists also challenge the previous view that globalization diffuses power. Rather, they argue that globalization actually grants some countries disproportionate control over certain economic hubs and flows of information. So some influential countries can cut out another country's access to key hubs in the global economy. According to this argument, which scholars call weaponized interdependence, coercion is therefore possible and thinkable. Just ask the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese, which have all been targeted by the United States and its partners. So in this world, the use of force remains costly, but not as costly as the previous liberal viewpoint suggests. It's not just these geopolitical changes, as I said, but the COVID-19 pandemic showed the vulnerability of economies to supply chain disruptions. And semiconductors were particularly affected, creating major disruptions across a whole range of industries. So what kind of a world are we finding ourselves in now? We're seeing decreased integration and growing bifurcation of the global economy. Joint research has grown more challenging due to frustrations about Chinese intellectual property theft and an increased threat perception of a Chinese military threat. Academic cooperation, I can testify, has fallen off. OSHER's experience is a testament to the decrease in cooperation. You were supposed to have speakers from China, and in the past, people like me very much enjoyed attending conferences in China, but such interaction has stalled because of political tensions and Chinese hostage-taking, and its recent foreign espionage law. So for all of those reasons, I don't feel like I can safely go to China anymore, which is a huge intellectual loss for me. And as a result of all of this, OSHER's Chinese speakers canceled. And many academics, of course, are experiencing this on a much wider scale. We also see a rupture in US-China trade relations. The US has essentially abandoned its hopes that China would end its intellectual property theft and treatment and biased treatment against US firms. To pressure China, the US first under Trump adopted tariffs, and under Biden has adopted export controls and kept many of the Trump-era tariffs. We're also seeing the phenomenon known as de-risking. US fears about political conflict in Asia and the concentrated nature of semiconductor manufacturing has led the US to pressure these key fabricators, Samsung and TSMC, to build plants in the United States. The US is worried about the potential for supply chain disruptions, both for the broader economy, but particularly out of concern for shortages that would affect the US ability to manufacture advanced weapons systems. China is de-risking too. China's quite fearful after the Russian experience of a US-led sanctions effort, should there be a conflict over, for example, Taiwan. So it's trying to increase its indigenous capacity in semiconductors in particular. China, we have to remember, also made itself quite vulnerable through its policies with respect to semiconductors. China focused on the stage known as assembly, packaging, and testing, and was a major player in that particular niche of the semiconductor supply chain. But it didn't design, it didn't build software, it didn't build any equipment, and it certainly didn't manufacture semiconductors itself. So China, as well as the US, during this previous era of turbocharged globalization, had made itself quite vulnerable. And now the Chinese are telling themselves, look what happened as a result. Look what the Americans did to us because we were vulnerable. We also see China's rise slowly bifurcating the international system. I think Marc put it really well when he talked about the emergence of blocs. And we see this not just politically, but across a multitude of areas in international affairs and the international economy. It's leading to the creation of rival digital orders. So Huawei as digital infrastructure has been rejected by the United States and many US partners, but it's embraced in many countries around the world. And so this creates a situation where American firms will find themselves, if you can't link to a country's digital infrastructure, they can't do business there. So that's creating this bifurcation in cyberspace. It's also leading to the creation of an authoritarian bloc, not an alliance by any means, but a bloc of countries that are supporting one another, as we see in Xi Jinping's support for Putin's war in Ukraine, and as we see in China's export of high-tech surveillance technology and other digital tools of authoritarian control to countries all over the world. So in sum, the dramatic changes that we've seen in US policies toward China, including particularly in the export controls, are very much part of this broader change in geoeconomics and geopolitics. And sadly, it's not because of domestic politics, it's not because of an individual leader. Either we like to blame Trump for things, I would love to blame him for this, we can blame Xi Jinping for this, but I have a feeling that it doesn't matter if China gets rid of Xi Jinping by some miracle, or if the United States, it doesn't matter who wins the next election. We're in a new era. We're in an era of increased tension and increased geoeconomic competition. And so that's where we find ourselves today, trying to do the best that we can, do the kind of engagement that we continue to need with China, and yet work our way through this very uncertain new time. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. So I've got a set of questions, and in the remaining time for this part, let's try to run through some things, and then we'll have more when we get back from coffee. Let's pull back and talk about the big picture a little bit first, and maybe Jennifer, I can start with you. Obviously, you laid out the fact that we're in a new era of conflict and confrontation, tension, rising tensions. This is coming from the fact that there is a consensus, I would say, in Washington, D.C., between Republicans and Democrats, not everybody, but a good chunk on each side, that the 20-plus years of engagement with China and the deepening of the economic relations with China has been a complete failure. So let me start with you and get your thoughts on that. Was it a failure? What do you think?
I would say you've absolutely described the consensus, which is when people talk about, again, what we call the engagement policy, the US policies toward China over the past basically 3 or so decades, they do characterize it as a failure. And I would say it depends on how you define success. If you define success as managing the rise of a great power without great power war, I think we've done pretty well. And I think that was a big part of the goal. Political scientists identify those periods of time in which there's a rising power. They identify those as being really dangerous and fraught with the potential for conflict and even war. And so managing that is a tremendous success in international politics, and we shouldn't trivialize this at all. It's not a low bar. It's a tremendous achievement. I should point out we managed this with Japan after World War II. Japan rose to great power, and we had Japan content with the role that it was playing in a sort of Western US-dominated system. West Germany rose to great power after World War II, and same thing. Both of those countries were content with the system. China was going to be a tougher case, right? It's not a US ally, it's not a democracy. So keeping the peace when you have a rising power is a really big deal. And the policy has so far succeeded at that by giving China entry into the system, by giving it status in the system, by giving it voice in the system. We don't like what it says, but that's kind of the deal, right? If you're going to give someone influence, you have to give them influence. Now, of course, people don't necessarily define the goals of the engagement policy in that way, and over time you would hear, particularly kind of the Clintonians and the Madeleine Albrights and this sort of thing, they would talk about the goal being to liberalize China. So we're going to trade with China. As I said before, we're going to create like this middle class that's going to demand more rights and so on. I mean, we could have a conversation about actually, has that succeeded to some extent? The Chinese people are much better off today relative to before this engagement policy. But obviously, if the goal was to democratize China, to liberalize China, that has not succeeded, and indeed, we're seeing Xi Jinping move toward taking away some of the freedoms that we've seen kind of in the early 2000s. So again, it comes down to how do you want to define the goals of the policy? It did a lot of good in terms of managing China's rise, but for those who were hoping for democracy, that obviously didn't happen.
Right, so yeah, that's one of the complaints, that the running thesis was that not only will economic liberalization help raise the middle class, but eventually China will become not only economically more open, but politically more open. The other side of the complaint that we also hear, of course, is that the trade relationship has created a series of supply chain dependencies on China. It's not unlinked from a larger problem of monopolization and trust that we have. But Marc, let me come to you for a second. Both your views on the engagement policy, you have any, but also thinking through, we hear all the time, because of these supply chain dependencies in critical areas like pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, certain technology inputs, and so forth, that there needs to be decoupling from China. Now, the term now that's in vogue or getting there is de-risking. So obviously respond to the first question if you have thoughts there, but also help the audience understand what exactly in practical terms does de-risking or decoupling look like? How far can it go? What are we talking about here?
Sure. So I think that think about the engagement and how to evaluate the engagement. It's hard to do this because oftentimes we're stuck with these counterfactuals. Like, what if China didn't join the WTO? Would we be better off? And I think that a lot of the academic work that I'm familiar with suggests that many of the jobs that we think have been lost to China, that somehow China has stolen these jobs, China also has fewer manufacturing jobs than they did 20 years ago. It's called productivity, robotics, automation. And most of those jobs that we've lost in the US seem to be traced to technology. Think about ATMs replacing tellers. When I was younger, I thought it'd be great to have a secretary. Remind me when my anniversary is, do these little errands, right? You know who's our secretary now? Bill Gates. He's replaced that. Microsoft Office. I'm expected to do my own typing. So I think that I think that it's easy in the United States I think we do a good job. We do our best job when we think someone's chasing us, when someone's about to eat our lunch. And if China didn't exist, we'd have to create it. We'd have to create an enemy to drive us. After the Soviet Union collapsed, it wasn't going to be the Soviets anymore. So I think the Chinese have a function in American psychology and in politics as like the enemy that we've got to be running faster than. So what does this mean? I mean, the decoupling, de-risking. I think it is the economic fact or economic event of these years that characterize what's going on. And it depends on how you want to look at it, what level of like depth you want to look at it. In some ways, China is the biggest market for, say, General Motors. So what does it mean for General Motors to decouple from China? It's hard to play that out without them giving up their largest market. And that is why several of the large semiconductor companies were in Washington earlier this week lobbying the legislatures, lobbying the Biden administration to find a way to reduce their sanctions, because that's their largest market. For some of these tech companies, 40 to say 60%, maybe for some of them 20% of their revenues come from China. So denying them access to China is going to hurt Americans who've invested. We've invested our 401k money, our savings into some tech companies, into the NASDAQ 100, and now they're going to be squeezed because we don't want to sell China semiconductor chips. I wonder, frankly, how successful those technological barriers or prohibitions tend to be. I think that they tend to encourage a type of development that we might not be familiar with. For example, if I understand it right, the U.S., is willing to let China have access to 14 nanometer semiconductor chips. And the one that the TSMC now is delaying in Arizona was going to be, I think, 4 or 5. And China says that it looks like what China is being able to do. It's hard to tell what's truth versus the propaganda, but it looks like China is able to take that 14 nanometer technology and make 7 nanometer. Just think about nanometer being about the thickness of a piece of hair you might have still, if we're lucky, huh? And I think that what we're seeing is some companies are moving that production out of China, part of it out of China, almost like duplication. And some of the countries that seem to be the big winners might be from Chinese companies themselves, like how U.S. companies moved into Maquiladora, into the northern part of Mexico. Well, some Chinese companies are moving into Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. And so there does seem to be some effort to move away production from China. It's hard to always see it in the aggregate data. It's really, I think, industry-specific and oftentimes company-specific. But it does seem like it's taking place. And of course, when it comes to portfolio investment, if you have a Chinese bond, you can sell that Chinese bond. It takes you 2 seconds to do, no problem. But foreign direct investment, building factories, points of production, distribution, that takes a longer time. And so it reminds me of that story that they tell in China about a butterfly that lives for a day. And it lands on a big, powerful oak tree, but doesn't see the oak tree move. And so the butterfly thinks the oak tree's dead. And so I think we want to give it some time before we make dramatic things here. But China is also in the same position. Look, they're held captive by a duopoly on operating systems, OIS and Android. It makes no sense for them to do that. And so even before COVID, the movement towards, I think it's called Made in China 2025, or in the U.S., Buy America or Build in America, those are expressions of the same like underlying politics, which that's why I call it import substitution. Well, you used to import, now try to make yourself. And the last thing I'd say about it is that the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. sounds like a wonderful idea. But it's not going to necessarily mean jobs coming back to the U.S., because those new factories, to compete price competitively, is going to be highly automated, robotic. It's going to have fewer people working in them, though the output might still be good. Fewer people working. So it's not really necessarily a solution for our employment challenges.
Jennifer, let's actually address the same issue about the Biden, you talked about the Biden administration's obviously semiconductor restrictions. And of course, this is not just telling American companies that they can't sell a particular type of chip into China, but this is also being able to tell other companies, whether they be from the Netherlands or South Korea. There's a thing now, we've changed the foreign direct product rule out of commerce, which means that if there is any US product that's in the end product, US input or part into the end product, then they must seek our approval. Commerce has to sign off on it, give it a license before they can sell to China. So give us your view. Mark obviously just said that he doesn't think it's on the whole going to be very successful, it sounds like, nor maybe is it a good idea because of short-term investor losses, long-term problems of bringing manufacturing back. Talk to us about your views of the policies, if it's good, successful, and if not, why not, and so forth.
I think it's a sensible policy. And it's going to be a really hard policy. So for the reasons that Mark mentioned, it's going to be really hard for it to succeed. And just again, the important thing is to first ask, well, what's the goal of the policy? The goal, and the administration is very clear on this, is the goal is to keep China off the military technological cutting edge for as long as possible. So it's not broad economic decoupling. And that actually creates an interesting rift in US politics, because some leaders they want a broader decoupling, and the administration is not urging for that at this time. So it's specifically, when we think about the vast semiconductor industry, we're talking about 1% of the chips. So this is a tiny, tiny amount of what is actually traded and what China actually is importing and what we're exporting and so on. So why is it such a hard policy? So number one, because China is going to adapt. And as Mark said, they are a technological powerhouse. This is what my book is about. China has become a really impressive innovation-led economy to all predictions were to the contrary. We didn't think China could do this, but it's basically pulling this off. So now that it's being denied key parts of the semiconductor value chain, it's trying to create that itself at home. And this is going to be really challenging for the most advanced chips, like Mark was mentioning. But we're trying to, Mark and I are reading all the same articles and trying to figure out, have they reached the 5 nanometer level yet? And so we're not really sure. They're claiming that they have and so on, but they're still not able to manufacture that at scale, even if they have. So that's yet another step. There's all sorts of other workarounds. So first of all, it's can they develop the indigenous capacity, and they may be able to do that. The other thing is, can they keep accessing the stuff that we don't want them to access? And there's all sorts of workarounds. And here we can turn to my colleague, Mike Mastanduno, in the government department, literally wrote the book on this for the Cold War regime called COCOM, which tried to deny advanced technology to the Chinese and to the Soviets. And so basically what we're doing now is a very, very similar repetition of that regime. There's some differences, but basically it's the same effort. So we look back to that regime and we say, well, what happened? Well, we saw that the Soviets and Chinese obtained a lot of the technology through espionage. The problem with the Soviet Union is they then didn't know what to do with that technology, and their economy was so messed up that it didn't do them much good. The Chinese are not like that. They will know what to do with this technology. So that's a problem. The Soviets and the Chinese got technology through third parties, through neutral countries. And there's interesting technological changes today. Basically, we're talking about denying China the supercomputing power that it needs, particularly to train AI algorithms. You need massive computing power for that. You need the most advanced chips for that. We hear stories that the Chinese are able to rent chips. I'm not making this up. They're going to cloud computing firms in Singapore to be able to train their AI models. They don't need chips. They're training the models that way. So there's all sorts of these workarounds. Okay, I've only been talking about China here. Let's talk about coalition management. So Shahzad mentioned we have to have these other countries on board that are key players. We have internal coalition management. So someday you got to buy Ellen Frost a cup of coffee and ask her about her experiences in the Carter administration at these COCOM meetings. And the Department of Commerce wants a shorter list because they're being lobbied by Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, who's saying, you're going to wreck my company with these sanctions. The Department of Defense wants a longer list because they're really worried about these chips getting into advanced weapon systems. So there's massive intra-agency fights going on. And right now, we also have Congress bashing the administration, saying, why aren't your lists longer? Trump's lists were longer. Why aren't your lists longer? Okay, so you have completely forces pulling in the opposite direction. Then there's the external coalition management. Are the South Koreans going to be with us on this? They're concerned about their firms too. What about the Taiwanese? You would think they'd be pretty concerned about this. What about the Netherlands? They live pretty far away from China in the Taiwan Strait. So again, is this going to work? If we look back to this Cold War example, we see a much more adept technological player in China. We see all the same troubles of internal coalition, not really coalition, interagencies, intra-US problems, and then we see the external coalition management problems. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, wow, who's going to pull that off, right? Is that really possible? So it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way export controls are announced, but then the way the work in practice is very different. Even when there are restrictions in place, BIS at Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, then goes back and gives about 70 to 80% of licenses, which actually say you can continue providing the chips, you can continue working in China. So the way you may read about export controls in the press is not necessarily how export controls work out in practice. Now, I think we're at time for our coffee break. So why don't we do that? I'm going to be looking through, is that correct? Yeah? Okay, very good. And then I'm going to be looking through some questions from the audience. We still have some more that we were discussing backstage, and we'll come back and keep this going. Thanks. Okay, excellent. Good to be back. So we've got lots of great audience questions here, and they actually tie in really wonderfully with a lot of the things that I was also itching to ask both of you anyway. So I'll try to read the questions here and see where there's overlap, and perhaps we can hit a few at the same time, because there's some that are asking the same thing essentially. There's a bit of just a quick fact or a clarification question. Somebody asks, what does the CCP mean? That's the Chinese Communist Party. At least in today's context, it's the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, moving on. So, Mark, you've talked obviously about this whole de-dollarization trend, right? Every so often, there's this rise in narrative and commentary saying that we're in an era of de-dollarization. Now, Twitter and social media have obviously supercharged some of that. So, talk to us about the idea that if, China did want to become the global reserve currency, how would they even go about doing it and so forth? There are a couple of questions to that effect here. I don't have a name here, at least, but it says, will China's currency replace the US dollar? There's another question that says, again, I don't have a name here, it says, what are the practical obstacles to having a fully convertible renminbi? So talk about the broader context, of course, and then perhaps you can specifically get at these questions.
Sure. So when you go traveling, maybe you go to Canada or Mexico, you go to the airport and you convert some dollars into the local currency. You can't do that with China. China's currency, we say, is unconvertible, which means that you can't, that the Chinese currency has no value outside of China. In fact, what China has done and what the markets have supported is an offshore. So there's an onshore RMB, that's the currency that trades within China. And then there's an offshore RMB. The onshore RMB we call CNY, Chinese yuan. And the offshore RMB we call CNH, because its center is in Hong Kong, which of course is part of China, but it's regarded as offshore for these kind of technical purposes. Businesses who trade have really access to CNH. The CNH, the offshore RMB, you need to go through special, you had to jump through some hoops to go from the CNH to bring that offshore RMB onshore. The currency is not convertible, and that would be the first step, is to make it convertible. And that is to say, treat it like most other major countries' currencies, Japanese yen, the euro, the British pound. You go to the airport, you can get those money offshore. Oftentimes, emerging market countries, developing countries have done this with multiple exchange rates. I think South Africa for a while had 4 or 5 different exchange rates that they had to merge. When China took back Hong Kong, they promised not to do anything with the exchange rate for 50 years. Many people don't think that they're going to adhere to their promise of 50 years. When the communists took over in 1949, Shanghai was the financial center. It was punished when the communists took over for its Western influences. Many people think that Hong Kong will be punished the same way when Shanghai now develops as a bigger, more important financial center. If I were to advise President Xi on what to do to truly challenge the dollar, I think there's 3 things I would do. The first, of course, is to make the currency convertible. If it's not convertible, it limits its use. That means that my example before about Australia selling iron ore to China in US dollars, well, you want to be able to do that in RMB, but you can't if the currency is not convertible. The second thing I would do is what I say is as a store of value, the dollar's role as a store of values, right? So economists typically talk about 3 functions of money: a unit of account, a means of transactions, and as a store of value. And my suggestion is really the dollar's key role is as a store of value. China can't really offer a store of value because our store of value is not dollars per se, but US Treasury bonds. Foreign central banks don't have dollars, they have US Treasuries. China has things a bit backwards, if I'd say that. what they do not have a large central government debt, less than 20% of GDP. Ours is over 100% of GDP. Most of European countries are over 100% as well. What China's debt is in local governments, regional governments, and they cannot borrow money directly. So what they do is they set up these special purpose vehicles, like an Enron type of situation, if you will, where these special purpose vehicles borrow the money, issue bonds. The debt is in these local governments, and the relationship between the local government debt and the central government's debt is not clear. Think about what happened when New York was failing a couple of years ago. U.S. states can't declare bankruptcy. It's a real problem in the U.S. It's a challenge for local government. Same kind of situation in China, where the debt of the local government is oftentimes too much, and their bonds have lost a lot of value. So if anybody's seen the musical Hamilton, you know what Hamilton did in the United States. It was called assumption. That is, the federal government assumed the state's debts. And there's a big debate over that because some states didn't experience the war in their state, or didn't experience very much. So the states that had a lot of debt wanted the federal government to assume the debt, as you can imagine. The other states who didn't have a lot of war in their territory, in their space, didn't necessarily want the Hamiltonian solution of assumption. If I was Xi, that's what I would do, is assume the state's debts in some fashion. That is, to have a large federal central government bond market that could truly compete with the U.S. Treasury market in terms of size and depth. And the third thing I would do if I was trying to really challenge the dollar is have bonds denominated in RMB outside of China. So, for example, I mentioned before Brazil has dollar bonds. Mexico has dollar bonds. Many emerging market countries have dollar bonds. They borrow dollars because oftentimes U.S. interest rates are cheaper, are lower than in the home country. And some countries, think about like Saudi Arabia, they have dollar revenues. A dollar bond has dollar liability, and now they have a matched book, if you will. So what I would suggest in China's case then is, in addition to making currency convertible, having a larger central government bond market, is really develop what we call the panda market. Panda bonds are foreign companies or countries that issue RMB bonds in China. By doing so, that creates a demand for the currency, like it does for US dollars. The reason why Lula doesn't know why everybody chooses dollars is because his own country borrows dollars and sells their goods in dollars. They have other countries make the laws, make the rules and regulations easier for companies and countries to issue panda bonds. So Brazil, for example, won't have to issue a dollar bond, they could issue a panda bond. But that requires a certain loss of control that doesn't seem like China is ready to bear quite yet.
Okay, excellent.
Can I add one quick thing?
Please.
So I always find this issue so confusing when I'm reading about it in the media, and so I really appreciated Marc's intervention. I had one other thing that I picked up on that helped me, which is I really think, as he was suggesting, there's a tremendous gap in perceived stability and sort of levels of trust between the dollar and the U.S. financial system and the UN and the Chinese system, which is much more opaque and has all these other issues. So I read one article that said, when we're thinking about potential currencies that wouldn't replace, but maybe, overtake, or not overtake, what did you use? You said? Supplement? No, it was like, it's not going to overtake, but it will grow more influential. So they compared this to the rental car market. And they said the US government, the dollar is Hertz. The euro is Avis. And so that made me think about, in grad school, my husband and I, we couldn't afford Hertz or Avis. And we were in Cambridge, and there was this kind of questionable place we would take the bus to in Somerville. And we called it Crazy Eddie's rental car. I don't know what the name actually was. That's what we called it. China's currency is Crazy Eddie's rental car. So I think Marc's right. It's going to be a while before this is going to challenge even Avis, right? let alone the other. Oh.
Mark, let me come back to you, actually. There are a couple of questions, sanctions related, and then one that I have. The sanctions related question says, sanctions against Russia don't seem to have made much of a difference. Is that right? What about the use of sanctions more generally? You talked a little bit about that. Obviously, you'll respond to that as well. But let's think broadly when a lot of the war gaming around Taiwan happens. In the aftermath of the Russia experience with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the things that's talked about is, in your words perhaps, firing China from the dollar system, removing them from SWIFT. Is that likely? How likely? What could be the repercussions of doing that? So perhaps you can talk about sanctions policy and its effectiveness in the Russia case, and then thinking through about the potential use of the same tools vis-a-vis China in the event that China invades Taiwan.
Yeah, amazing, huh? Tough questions. One of the things that I had done a master's in international relations, and one of the key points that sticks with me to this day is it's a bad policy if you can't enforce it. And I think about the sanctions on Russia post the invasion of Ukraine, and there's a lot of work done on showing how precisely the sanctions are being evaded. Simple things. And trade issues, semiconductor issues. There seems to be the sanctions aren't an iron wall. It seems more like a flour sifter. Right, a sieve that you've got a lot of holes that it's getting through for various reasons. Some neutral countries, sometimes it seems that commercial, I don't know what the right word is, but commercial prowess overrides, say, patriotism. People see a customer, and I'd say that there's a rule, we call it the angel law. And I think I forget the philosopher Angel, where it comes from, but I think it was British. But the argument is that those who impose the sanctions often get hurt by them themselves. And I think that this is one of those cases where, not so much perhaps with Russia, because the trade ties, leaving aside food and energy, think also not just gas and oil, but also think about uranium that comes from Russia. But the trade ties weren't nearly as deep or as extensive as they are with China. China, I think, as the professor noted, is a sort of I think from The Wizard of Oz, they say it's a horse of a different color. And I think it's just the scale and the integration of China into the world economy is so much greater than Russia's ever was. So I'm skeptical about sanctions. I think buying time, perhaps. But as far as really punishing them, it varies, and we also lose our nerve on coming to sanction important things that people need, like food. So I'm just not convinced that the sanction regime can do much more than buy a little bit of time. But at the same time, the extensive use of those sanctions scares people away from being too beholden to the United States at the same time. So I think that those kind of sanctions, I think, cut both ways.
And you would say, and in the Taiwan case, China is a completely different beast than Russia in many ways, right?
Yeah, I think that if, short of a shooting war, I think that cutting China off of the SWIFT system, which, as you probably know, the SWIFT system is the way banks communicate with each other. It's really a messaging system. And people have thought that after China was allowed to join the SDR, the IMF special drawing right, which comes about after the end of Bretton Woods, because people thought there wasn't enough dollar liquidity, and they wanted to supplement the dollar liquidity. And the SDR, special drawing rights, is a basket of currencies that the Chinese currency was allowed to join. And once it joins it, that means that every country, so the IMF every so often grants SDRs. And because China is in the SDR, it means that it's a legitimate reserve currency, even though it's a relatively small one. By small, I mean 2 to 3% really. And of that, Russia accounts for the bulk of it. But now that countries have SDRs, all countries have SDRs, RMBs in the SDR countries have RMB exposure. I think it's very hard to deny them the SWIFT system that allowed them to settle those kinds of things. As I mentioned, countries have developed their own payment systems to bypass the SWIFT system. China has its own system called CHPS. It's like the U.S. chips. That's what we call our system, chips. Of course, if you've bought some of these knockoffs from China, there's something sometimes missing, letters missing from a name, and that's what they've done with the chips. Our chips now is CHPS in China. That's their payment platform. So but I think that if there is a shooting war over Taiwan, it'll be a lot bigger than just these sanctions. Because, of course, in a shooting war, it's like you typically do want to sanction your adversary. But it's really in short of a war, what can you do? And I think that it's one of those things where you cut the nose to spite the face by blocking China in such a direct way like that. So I think highly unlikely that we would have to resort to that. There's a lot of, I think what oftentimes happens, I think of these things as an escalation ladder. And cutting China off the SWIFT system would be a big step towards the top end of the escalation ladder. And I do think that oftentimes, I'd say people want to skip steps in the escalation ladder, and I find policymakers want to oftentimes create more steps in the escalation ladder. And so I think that this would be I think it makes sense to take one step at a time, and this would be a huge escalation of issues in which China, of course, there's lots of different ways China can fight back that it hasn't done so yet. You know, they put those sanctions on those couple of minerals, and these are export controls. These aren't export restrictions. They're just, you have to fill out some forms, and we want to make, sort of like what the U.S. does with, as you described, those export licenses. That's really what China's done, but China could really crank that up if they wanted to. They tried this a few years ago. They were annoyed at Japan for one reason or another, and they were going to cut off the rare earths access to China. Excuse me, China was going to cut off the rare earths access to Japan. And there was a big blowback, including at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which unfortunately now, because of both the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the WTO is not really working properly because there's no adjudication process. You lose a case and you don't have there's no appeal, which means if you lose the case, you've lost it. And so I think that sort of renders the WTO less effective in enforcing this kind of thing now. But I can imagine a situation short of a war where China just ramps up the choke points that we talk about in the global economy and the supply chains. It can squeeze those in a way it hasn't quite yet.
Excellent, thank you. Jennifer, if I could now move to you on the semiconductor issue. It's an anonymous question again. It says, is it poor foresight that has led to this semiconductor issue in that without the drastic change in leadership style of Xi Jinping, would we be in this mess? And there's also a second question, which you can tag on if you'd like. Does China lead the US in quantum computing? So let's talk about the semiconductor stuff first. Would we be in this quote unquote mess to begin with? And of course, you can tie into it your great work on China's technological leadership.
These are great questions. The poor foresight question is really interesting. Sort of feels like Monday morning quarterbacking to some extent, given how the many different ways in which the world might have gone in different directions. I mean, essentially, the question is, should the U.S. have had an industrial policy? Should the U.S. government exercise more control over the evolution of the semiconductor industry? And to be clear, I mean, the people in the U.S. like to think of ourselves as we have this like freewheeling economy and it's all decentralized and the government, you know, takes a step back and it's laissez-faire. That was not how semiconductors came about. There was so much Pentagon money put into Silicon Valley, and that's basically the foundation of all of that industry there. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting ways in which the US government had a more liberal strategy about how to go about that, such as having the partnerships between private firms and universities and so on, and not trying to control from above. But it was a lot of government investment. So the question now is, should the U.S. government have been even more involved and controlled this more? Because basically what the semiconductor firms realized is they were building this technology for the space race, right? For American missiles, essentially, for nuclear weapons. And they sort of realized, hey, we could do a lot more things with this technology, and they started putting this into just everyday technology. And so that's how it ended up as it is today, is through the realization among private firms that they could create a whole commercial industry, not just a defense industry, out of this. So we might not have a semiconductor industry if the government had tried to control it from the get-go. Maybe we would just have had a bunch of missiles, right? So it's kind of it's a hard question to answer, because given what we know about state involvement in, industrial policy, sometimes it pays off pretty well, particularly if the government goes about it in a sensible way, and sometimes it doesn't. And this is the big question about China today, and we're talking about China's efforts to create its own semiconductor industry. The government is putting just unbelievable amounts of money toward this, and so far it hadn't been very successful. And we can talk about the corruption that happens, the tremendous waste, and so on. Are they picking the right winners, right? Are they giving the money to the right firms? Usually you succeed at this kind of government industrial policy, like we saw in Japan and South Korea, because of the constraints imposed by a really competitive export market. So that's what made sure that those South Korean and Japanese and, to date, Chinese firms were going to be competitive, as their products had to compete on a broader export market. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about that tiny 1% of semiconductors. They're not going to be exporting those. So it might not go very well. So I think I'm going to, with apologies to Alexander Hamilton, who does have all the best songs, I have to say, I think I'm going to remind the virtues of Ricardo in this conversation, and note that the reason we have this tremendous industry we have today was because partly from government involvement, but very much because of the free market operating the way that it did, and private firms making the decisions that they made.
Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
So when I think about the U.S. expansion, how do U.S. companies service foreign demand? It's not by exporting. That hasn't been true since I've been alive. U.S. companies service foreign demand primarily by building closer to them. That is, instead of an export-oriented strategy, which is a typical thing that you hear about South Korea, Europe, especially Germany, Japan, China, the U.S. has what I'd say is a foreign direct investment strategy: build locally, sell locally. There's a book in the, I want to say it was in the early 70s, called American Challenge. And the author argues that the domination of U.S. multinationals in Europe, that's what he was talking about, the American Challenge. Was American companies, to me, the semiconductor model of building overseas, allowing these production to go, same thing happened to color television sets. I think we might have invented them in the United States, but we don't produce any. And I think, to me, that model of export-oriented versus foreign direct investment. And by foreign direct investment, right, think about portfolio investment is buying stocks and bonds. Foreign direct investment is building or buying factories, production points. And this is the way the U.S. companies have serviced the world, but it's also a developmental strategy. How do developing countries develop? Partly because U.S. companies, but also some foreign companies, increasingly Japanese companies, some European companies, they build their factories, hire local people. That leads to a transfer of technology. It leads to, a greater prosperity in those countries. You think about South Korea, Taiwan. You think about what happened to Europe after World War II. The rebuilding takes place because of foreign companies mixing with like local businesses, but also building points of production. This is a transfer of technology and employment strategy. And to me, the semiconductor, when it came to semiconductor, here's how we do things, and semiconductors weren't an exception, which I think to your point about industrial policy, we were hesitant about picking winners because of our anti-government philosophy, we think, that the government can't pick winners and the market's a better place to pick the winners, and we sort of equate semiconductors and hamburgers, or potato chips and semiconductor chips might be a better comparison. That doesn't really matter what the product is. Letting companies do this and building locally, selling locally is really, I think this is really what we mean by globalization. Build locally, sell locally, and that's what's being unwound. This foreign direct investment was where the supply chains would go.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a question about quantum computing. There's all sorts of stuff. So there is, I believe, as it's referred to nowadays by the administration, the strategy of denial, right, on all that. But putting that aside and our approach to that, where is China in its technological advancement on the semiconductor side, on other technologies that you've, especially I'm sure you've written about in your book?
This is something where we've just seen tremendous change over the past decade. And in my field and others, people have been really observing China and trying to figure out, is China going to be capable of high-tech innovation? And the economists care about this because China has reached the point in its development where it can't keep generating growth from inputs of labor and capital. It needs to generate productivity improvements. That's what leads to growth. And so you need to innovate. You need innovation for that. So the economists care for that reason. The political scientists care because technological power is one of the key attributes of a great power in international politics. So you can't compete against the United States. You can't compete against whichever great powers are out there unless you're a technological leader. So everybody's been keenly watching China to see if can China innovate? And people were quite pessimistic, as I mentioned earlier, given that we're talking about an illiberal system. And we have this idea that, well, innovation can't possibly flourish in a system like that because there's denials of movement and speech, free speech, and there's so many reasons. They're doing a lot of political education when, they should be devoting those hours to just normal education. And so people were skeptical about this. But as I said, over the past decade or so, we've seen China really climb the innovation rankings in the world, as according to a variety of metrics that we use, like patents, like highly cited research papers, high-tech exports, right? So there's all these different metrics that people look to. I'll have to ask Shahzad for the data in his beige book. So the data are really tricky to work with, and so this is one of the things that I'm sure firms come to the beige book for. When you look at that data, as I said, you do see that China is improving significantly. And the way that I look at this in my book is to say, we want to know, can China operate at the technological cutting edge? Like, has it joined the ranks of the most innovative countries in the world? And those countries, based on a whole set of those metrics that I just mentioned, those countries are generally, there's kind of, this might surprise some people, at the top are Japan and the United States. So there's those two, which are generally far ahead above other countries. And then there's kind of a clump of countries on the graph. And those countries are basically South Korea, Taiwan, the European, like EU countries like France, Britain, Germany. We see occasionally, depending on are we talking about AI versus quantum versus whatever, there might be, certain countries will show up in different places like Israel or Singapore or I don't know. So those are sort of the usual suspects that we see in this category of countries operating at the cutting edge. And so that, I argue, is what we need to know in terms of, is China innovative? Can it have the ability to compete in great power competition with, in this case, the United States? What we frequently do see in media coverage, though, and actually in a lot of academic work, is kind of a horse race model, where they say, is China overtaking the US? And so point number one is they don't have to, right? In order to compete economically, compete militarily, they don't have to overtake the US on these graphs. They just need to be in that top group of countries, which they are. Okay, so if you see the article, it says China's not going to overtake the US in fill in the blank. It doesn't matter. Just ask yourself, where are they? Are they close? Do they have rough parity? Because that's a very big deal. For the emerging technologies that people tend to care about, the big one is artificial intelligence. It's known as a general purpose technology, similar to semiconductors, similar to, before that, electricity, previously the steam engine, right, steel, right? So there are some technologies that transform basically every industry. And AI is seen as like that. And so that's the one that gets a lot of attention. And basically, I think the conclusion is that the two world leaders in AI are China and the United States. And so you can break it down into certain kinds of applications and so on. That the US is leading, and I think here actually arguably still we can say will lead when it comes to language models, like the Chat GPT and so on. This is where it matters if you control the information, right? The algorithm's only as good as the information you're going to give it. And so if you don't give it information, it's going to be less powerful. So, but then China is vastly far ahead of us in facial recognition and also voice recognition, for reasons that this is related to regime security. So they have massively deployed already government systems for facial recognition and so on, and we don't have remotely that. So quantum is another area of interest. Here, the questioner specifically asked about that. There's quantum supercomputing, which the US is really good at, China's really good at. So again, it's kind of, they're competing against one another. Quantum communications is actually a realm in which China has moved ahead. And so that's basically, they put a quantum satellite in the air. And the idea here is that this is basically a revolution in encryption, that you cannot hack that satellite. You cannot hack that communication. And so this obviously has huge military implications. And so China's lead in that area is quite disturbing to the US military, and we're working hard to catch up there. China also is leading in terms of electric vehicles. It's now the #1 producer of electric vehicles around the world, I guess, while Elon was busy wrecking Twitter. That happened. And EV batteries. So not just the vehicles, but the fuel, the batteries for those. And so we've seen China kind of leap ahead in some of those areas. When we talk about all of these technologies, there's biotech, there's clean energy, there's quantum, there's all of these. We're really entering in a new era, and it's just too early to know like what are going to be the key technologies, let alone the key firms and the key applications and so on. So I just want to emphasize we're at a very early stage. But if the question is, does it look like China can kind of run with the big dogs? It already is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there's, I mean, not for this audience, this is a very informed audience here today, but generally for the public, I think there's a real need to update the view of China, because they're no longer the factory of the world in the sense of producing T-shirts and shoelaces. They're doing very advanced, cutting-edge stuff. And the national ambition is to not necessarily dominate globally, but to be an important input into other technological products around the world, to occupy that very important space. And that's kind of what they've been working toward. I say this somewhat in jest, but perhaps a marker of Chinese companies being the true global leaders will be when American technological companies go to DC and lobby commerce to take on the Chinese companies rather than lobbying commerce to let them sell to Chinese companies. So that's the tension to look out for. We can move a little bit toward some current affairs items. So let's think about, so we've had a lot of high-profile visits that have taken place. We had, obviously, the Treasury Secretary Yellen, who was in China. We just had the climate envoy, John Kerry. We've had a meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and his counterpart. That was in Europe, I believe. I could be getting the location wrong now. So there is a bit of a charm offensive and a cooling of temperatures, it seems like, that the administration would like to pursue. This is where we're hearing the de-risking stuff. Maybe I start with you, Mark, and then I come to Jennifer. How successful have these trips been? What's the idea if it's not what I said? And if you have more thoughts on it, what's the progress? What are we trying to get done here, and how successful are we being across the board? Anyone specific, you can run with it. And if you want to comment on former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's trip, feel free to do so.
Yeah. What an interesting time, right? You got the two big superpowers of our generation, and they weren't talking to each other very much. And I think Americans' attitude is talking is good. But I tend to think that this is cosmetic. It's mostly putting, I'd say, lipstick on a pig.
Be careful, Mark. Companies have gotten in trouble.
Yeah. But I think that what we ultimately want is a change in behavior. Words are cheap. And having talks when we still are, say, selling advanced weapons to Taiwan, we're going to still make visits, high official visits to Taiwan. I think we send ships into freedom of navigation, even though we're not a signatory. We never, our Congress never confirmed the law of the seas, which is not part. Then the U.S. isn't a member of it, but we try to uphold it anyways, in kind of a weird kind of type of leadership, perhaps. So I'm not convinced. I think that what happens is the U.S. wants to still do what we do, sell arms to Taiwan, send ships into the straits, do what I think are provocative actions. And when I think about it, I mean, I'm really struck. I tried this on the Chat GPT or the Barron, the Google version, and I said, how many bases does the U.S. have in the Indo-Pacific region? And it said 66 main bases, and it gave me the source for that, a Congressional Research report, CRS. Yeah. And I wonder if China, Russia, had anything like that in our neighborhood, how open, how transparent the U.S. would be. And I think this is also partly realist politics. It says that the U.S. can have its sphere of influence. We can have a buffer zone. The Caribbean is our lake. We can veto foreign direct investment in Mexico if we don't like it. But China can't have that, and Russia can't have that. We can have it because we can take it, literally take it. And so I am not sure that the high-level negotiations or high-level talks are going to result in a change of behavior from the U.S. or from China. China continues to act like a bully in its own neighborhood, which gives the U.S. an opening. We get so carried away about China perhaps having a listening post in Cuba. If they had 66 military bases around us, I think we'd be a lot different. And it's not, China, I think, is on its own trajectory. I think China's problems are, for example, on a big scale, we talk about middle income trap. It seems to be that there's a handful of countries that can go from being poor to like middle class. It's very hard to take it to that next step to become high income. China's got a demographic problem from, left over from the one-child policy. They have this debt problem. We see this clearly with COVID, that there's an unrest below the surface, where people, I think, were asked to make this an unwritten social contract. You, Chinese people, give up political ambitions so you can join the Communist Party, which is, I think, the largest political party in the world. You can join the Communist Party, but that's how you can channel your political ambitions. This obviously is not, I mean, in exchange for that, sacrificing those political ambitions, you get, we, the Communist Party, take care of you. And that is, we give you a rising living standard that you, your grandparents couldn't even dream about in China. You've seen those pictures, Shanghai from like the from the early 70s to Shanghai now. It's like a completely different world. And I think that, so to me, that China's problem of trying to, can it be one of the few countries to overcome the middle income trap? That's not going to be decided in Washington, even if we can postpone it for a little bit. And our problems, I think that the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Haas, has been very good about this in his latest book, saying that our problems, however you want to characterize them, for me, I'd rank up there that we have a mass shooting almost every day in the United States. Our longevity is falling in the United States, unlike many other industrialized countries. The disparity of wealth and power in the U.S., these are serious problems that they're not going to go away, but they're not, the solution's not in Beijing. Any more than Beijing's middle income challenge can be located in Washington. And so for that reason, I'm a bit pessimistic on that these talks, which I'm afraid will just normalize antagonistic behavior. So we can still send ships into the Straits of Taiwan, but we can tell Taiwan, don't worry, we're not literally seeking their independence. Even though we arm them to the teeth, we're not seeking their independence. And I think that for the same thing that China, the talks, I don't think China was really, I think China has to go through these motions because I think ultimately it supports the hawks in China saying, look, we talked to the Americans and they haven't changed their behavior. The same way Americans say, we've got China in the WTO, we've got them integrated in the world trade system, but they haven't changed their behavior. And I think that this is like old couples, right? We know how to really annoy each other. We try to avoid doing it.
Go ahead, Jennifer, your perspective, characterization of the visits, what are they trying to accomplish, and how successful have they been at their own perhaps stated goals, if there were any?
Well, I have to say I'm kind of with Mark on this. So I'm definitely in favor of talking as opposed to not talking. That seems like a good thing. I've found the Chinese to be really great interlocutors. Like they just tell you what's on their mind, and you can have a very frank conversation, and I think that's a good thing. I also see that there is very much this kind of echo chamber in Washington, D.C. that's emerged these days, and it's actually kind of costly for people to step out of it. So anything that shatters that, including just hearing a different view expressed by the Chinese, I think is a good thing to remind us that not everybody sees the world the way we do, and not everyone is perceiving, and that there might be a different interpretation of Chinese actions than the one we're emphasizing, and so on. So I'm in favor of these talks, but yeah, like Mark, I mean, we're not going to be able to, there's nothing we can say to tell China, you know, you should allow Taiwan to be autonomous or even independent. We can't say anything to make them change their minds. Just like they couldn't tell us, you know, gosh, California used to belong to Mexico, you really should give it back. We'd be like, this conversation's over, right? I'm not having this conversation. So that's how they feel about Taiwan. And no talks are gonna change that. They might change whether or not they launch war against Taiwan, right? They will use force against Taiwan. So, but I think a whole other factor is like satellite imagery and this is, you know, weapons purchases by Taiwan and this sort of thing. That's going to be even more influential. I should commend to you that there's an article by my colleague at Stimson Center, Yun Sun. It's an article in Foreign Affairs that's just out that she talks about China using a refusal to talk strategically, basically to try, and it's kind of a brinksmanship policy to make the United States fearful of unintended escalation, unintended conflict, and to move the U.S. toward making greater concessions. And so just having talks has become a very strategic thing. And so all of that said, I'm still in favor of hearing the other side out.
Okay, with that, let's move towards the domestic politics side of this. And Jennifer, I'm going to stay with you here for a second, and then we'll get Marc's reactions. Today, the vast majority of Americans have a negative view of China, right? According to the most recent Gallup poll, something like 85% of Americans have a negative view of China. And according to, so Gallup's poll was, I think, around March of 2023. Pew's poll was around April or February, something around the same time of 2023 as well. And they found that 38% of Americans describe China as an enemy. Now, this is very different. When you look at the graph of these views of Americans changing, you just see it's been a very drastic shift in the last 20 years. So with elections coming up, China is going to be the main focus of most issues. What are the sorts of things that you think the voters and the public should be thinking about, asking the leaders, keeping top of mind as they hear about the various approaches to China? And I think there will be a lot of hard talk on China, but the approach will be very different. You have one side perhaps saying things like we should revoke the permanent normal trading relationship with China, the PNTR, whereas the other side saying the sanctions are perhaps working and will continue to refine and modify, et cetera, et cetera. So different levels of perhaps hawkishness are now going to be the new normal, if I had to be cliched about it. But sorry, so go ahead. Tell us about what should the general public be thinking about?
It'll be a really interesting thing to see how China is discussed in the campaign. And already here in New Hampshire, we're seeing some candidates start to come up and talk about it. I mean, this is a really sophisticated audience, so I don't think I have to tell you this, but I mean, I would just beware of simple answers of people who tell you that, well, obviously we have to do this. Like I was talking about with semiconductors. I mean, just the complexity of could we succeed at this and the cost to American industry and so on. There's no simple answer there. It's very fraught. There are big costs associated with going in either direction. And so just beware of the candidate that, they suggest something is quite straightforward. There was the House subcommittee on the CCP met yesterday. Actually, our moderator testified a week ago to the same committee. You can watch these hearings. They're really quite interesting. Yesterday's testimony, there was a member of the committee who was kind of huffing and puffing away at some poor hapless commerce official, basically saying why is the U.S. still trading with China? And if you're in favor of that, you're a traitor. And like suggesting oh, well, this is just empowering the CCP. And the ridiculousness of this, right? I mean, the U.S. economy is so still, we talk about decoupling, but still we are so interdependent with China. The number of U.S. jobs dependent on trade with China. The notion of let's just not trade with China, as Marc was talking about the effects of sanctions or the effect of that kind of a big, broad decoupling, that would be astronomical. That would be staggering on the U.S. economy. And so the notion that we should just not trade with China is such unbelievable ignorance by a public official. And come on, let's be adults, have an adult conversation about this really serious national problem. And, please go back to the kids' table, right? We don't need you, right? This is time for the adults in the room. And so ask the candidates, make sure that they can be one of those adults in the room. The good thing is in New Hampshire, you can. Like I asked Nikki Haley a couple weeks ago. So you can actually talk to people. You don't have to just rely on looking up their website or something. I would also say, just because I know, particularly in the Upper Valley, a lot of people, basically, for them, they talk about climate change as such a huge issue to them. And why are we not hearing enough about this and not seeing enough commitment and so on? And I would say that when it comes to China, and if you are one of the people that says climate is the most important issue for me, you need to prepare yourself to make some really terrible compromises. If someone's position is climate is the most important threat to the world, this is an existential problem, then you need to basically stop hammering China on human rights, on the Uyghurs, right? Because they're not going to talk to you about climate if you're hammering them about human rights. You can't defend Taiwan, right? Because China's not going to talk to you if you are supporting Taiwan. So there are some staggeringly difficult compromises that I think, for particular for people on the left, that here are these issues that they care a lot about, but they would need to compromise with respect to China on some of those. You cannot have them all because of Beijing's policy direction. And yeah, and then with respect to Taiwan, I would just say, I think Marc gave us a really nice sense of like strategic empathy of like how would we feel if we were surrounded by Chinese bases, or if China was arming, you know, I don't know, who's the most likely breakaway state? It's got to be Florida, right? It'll be Florida.
California before anybody else.
So if China was arming whoever, we would not take kindly to that. And so I think that kind of strategic empathy is really important. And then also asking, I mean, we're talking about should we impose sanctions in the SWIFT network? That would be so costly. If we're looking at conflict, if we're actually looking at a shooting war over Taiwan, those are the least of our problems. We are talking about going into a conflict, and there are a lot of people in the U.S. foreign policy community today that just say, we need to send American soldiers into that war. It's very important, and they rattle off, you know, they talk about why this is so important for America's image in the world. And you know, you need to sit down with your own thinking about this and ask, do I think that that's a compelling argument? Because just on the other side of it is we could lose thousands of American men and women in a conventional war. And that war also has significant risk of nuclear escalation. And nobody, the Taiwan hawks who are urging us down this path, and we are going down this path. Just look at the way that US policy toward Ukraine played out, right? We have this, it's like a liberal neoconservative coalition that's been driving that policy. This absolutely will happen with respect to Taiwan if there's a crisis there. And so I want you guys to ask now, before that time, how do I feel about that? And I want you to ask ask the candidates in the fire station or in the, Hanover High School or Lebanon High School cafeteria when you see them visiting. Ask them how they feel about that, because when we're talking about the loss of American cities, we better have a real good reason for why we went down that path.
Marc, let me pose you the same question with maybe a slight adjustment to it. You're no stranger to the policymakers and the policymaking world. So maybe throw in what you also think the candidates should be saying. We don't have to specify who the candidates will be. We can leave that alone. Your view of what you think American politicians, especially at the very top, should be talking about when it comes to China.
It's interesting. I consider myself such a realist that I don't really consider what they should be doing. But I think that what's maybe not understood is what they really are doing. And that is, I think that America needs to be taught to have an enemy. And I think that those polls you suggested it's a work in progress. I think that the American elite we're divided. And I think that what the Democrats have learned from the Cold War is they will never be accused of being soft on communism again. And to do so, they had to out-hawk the Republicans. And so to me, the American political elite is fairly united. They might, you mentioned some places where they differ, but to me on a high level, very similar. China is America's biggest threat. Our problems could be solved if only there was a regime change in Beijing. And of course, I can't accept that at face value. I think our problems are homegrown. But I know we're running out of time, but let me just give you maybe a sense of why we might not need to be so pessimistic. First, there's Taiwanese elections next year. And the KMT, that's the party that really fled from mainland China, but they are the more pro-China party now compared to the DPP that runs Taiwan now. And so with this election, with the KMT coming in, possibly coming in, they're running ahead in the polls, that could help cool off some of the tensions. Changing regime in Taiwan, because we're not going to get a regime change, I think, from the political elite in the US, regardless of the election outcome, or in China. Another reason I'm more optimistic, too, why we don't have to be so pessimistic about the near term, is I think that China's exports to the U.S. are falling. Partly it's because of sanctions, but what this means then is that the commercial tension is going to be falling a bit. We worry about China because at its peak it was about a third of our overall trade, and now they account for about 16% of U.S. imports. And the third reason I think that might not need to be so pessimistic is that both countries, the U.S. and China, I think are beginning to realize that their problems are domestic. China, as I mentioned, this demographic problem, this debt problem, they're going to be looking more internally. I think about who has been engaged in more wars outside their country, the U.S. or China. And to me, there's no competition, right? I mean, China has border disputes. India, Philippines, Vietnam. So I'm a bit more optimistic because I think a regime change in Taiwan, China's role in trade, as far as the U.S. deficit, is becoming a smaller part. I think both countries realize that a lot of the problems are domestic. And lastly, I think that the dollar, when the dollar is strong, obviously China is weak by sort of how the exchange rates work. But I think the dollar is about to go through, I think it's really begun last September and October, a big down cycle. And what I love about foreign exchange market is people like me, we don't have to change our minds often because the trends in the stock market last 6 months, a year maybe. Trends in the currency market last 5 to 10 years. And we're just getting done with a big uptrend in the US dollar. And as the dollar weakens, the RMB strengthens, and that also will help relieve some of the near-term tensions. I'm more nervous as far as the foreign policy in the U.S. election is more about Ukraine than about China. I think that's where the key dispute is. How much do we give, how much do we continue to arm Ukraine? How much of this is Ukraine fatigue? I see some people say if we can't protect our own borders, how do we hope to protect someone else's borders? So, but in the near term, I'm a bit more optimistic than the pessimism, but I do see the U.S. political elite united around this one, I mean, not around a lot of issues, but this is one issue I think they agree on. China's the enemy.
Okay, well, I think on that note, we're out of time. Let's give our panelists here a big round of applause. Thank you very much. This was great.